Sid Fleischman, The Scarebird, with pictures by Peter Siss. This is my first time reading this one. There's our title page. We can see what looks like a scarecrow to me, but they're calling it a scarebird. I wonder why. I guess we'll have to read to find out. Our two dedications are for Zachary and for Susan from the author and the illustrator. So there's our first picture. Let's see what it says. One time a lonely old farmer jammed some old clothes full of straw and put up a scarecrow. But the scarecrow had no head. Just keep the cuss-hollering birds out of the corn patch, said the farmer. You don't need a head for that. It was true. Crows and blackbirds circled the long-armed, long-legged scarecrow and kept at a safe distance. A scarecrow with no head. But as the first days of spring passed, the farmer, called Lonesome John by the folks in town, grew uneasy. Every time he looked up from his chores, there stood the headless scarecrow. And after supper, when he sat on the porch and played his nickel-plated harmonica, there against the fading sun stood the headless scarecrow. It's not the most fearsome sight I ever saw. It'll do, said Lonesome John in a loud voice. With his family gone and his old dog Sally Blue buried in the pasture, he had no one left to talk to but himself. That scarebird's enough to give a man the cold creeps. The next morning, Lonesome John hunted up an old pillowcase and stuffed it with straw. He used house paint to dab on a pair of yellow eyes. A hole in the pillowcase would do for a mouth. He sauntered to the corn patch and fixed the head to the neck of the scarecrow. Does that face suit you, Scarebird? You look like sunshine on stilts with them yeller painted eyes. Well, make yourself at home. So there's the head he made. The next day, when Lonesome John went out to start up his tractor, he gave a wave. Morning, Scarebird. I slept like a pine log. How about you? And in the evening, when he sat on the front porch playing his nickel-plated harmonica, he felt almost as if the scarecrow could hear every note. See you tomorrow, Scarebird, he'd call out when he went to bed. Lonesome John was sleeping like a pine log when he was awakened by wind banging the barn door. He'd heard wind before and went back to sleep. At daybreak, with the wind now howling and shrieking in his ears, he jumped out of bed. The Scarebird! He looked out the window. There stood the scarecrow face to face with the wind. Holding his ground, Lonesome John grinned. I figured you were a goner, Scarebird. But when he squinted his eyes, he saw that the wind was plucking straw from the scarecrow's cuffs and carrying it off in its hands and feet. See it coming out? Lonesome John rushed outside with a pair of shoes and work gloves and his pockets full of fresh straw. Within minutes, he had replaced the straw in the cuffs, put the gloves on, and laced the shoes up tight. You're good as new, Scarebird, and a little better, said, and then he added, ain't you all dressed up? Those are my town shoes, but I hardly go to town anymore, so you're welcome to them. The wind whisked itself away. The days turned hot. Before long, the sun was rising like a blowtorch at full blast. Morning, Scarebird. Looks like another scorcher today. Every time Lonesome John glanced up from his farm chores, there stood the scarecrow, bareheaded under the flaming sun. He remembered how old Sally Blue used to head for the shade under the house on hot summer days like this. Scarebird, you need a hat, he called. He picked out his wide-brimmed straw hat, his town hat, and set it on the scarecrow's head. He pulled the brim low over the sunflower yellow eyes. That's my bettermost hat, but you're welcome to it. The hot spell passed. The evenings cooled off, and after supper, Lonesome John sat on the porch playing old tunes on his nickel-plated harmonica. See you tomorrow, Scarebird. But dark clouds tumbled in during the night, and when Lonesome John awoke, he could smell rain, and he heard the windows chattering like baby rattles. It's going to rain blue thunderbolts. He rushed outside with his yellow slicker, pulled the arms of the scarecrow through the sleeves, and threw the hood over the wide-brimmed hat. When he had the rain gear buttoned, he looked up at the swollen clouds. Yes, sir, blue thunderbolts. Won't do to have you get soaked through and mold up, will it? The earth was drying out when Lonesome John hunted up his old checkerboard. He set an apple box in front of the scarecrow and opened the board. How about a game of checkers? I ain't played since the boys left home, so I'll be a mite rusty. You go first. Lonesome John moved a checker for the scarecrow and then one for himself. Before long, the game was far along, and Lonesome John was deep in concentration. Your move, Scarebird. Lonesome John hardly noticed the time pass. King me, Scarebird, I ain't licked yet. Then a shadow fell across the checkerboard. He looked up and saw a young man in worn jeans standing there, barefooted and bareheaded. Howdy, sir. Folks in town said you might need a hired hand. I get along by myself, answered Lonesome John. Yes, sir. Lonesome John wanted to get back to the checker game, but the stranger looked foot-weary and hardly more than 16 or so. You legged it all these miles? Didn't they tell you it's so far to my place that crows pack a lunch before setting out? If you're hungry, you'll find bread and side meat in the kitchen. Thanks. And open a can of peaches while you're at it. Lonesome John resumed the checker game, though his mind was no longer on it. The hired hand finished his meal. I'll chop you some stove wood before I head back. Just a stick or two will be fine. Lonesome John finished up the checker game, but felt foolish with a stranger looking on. He was careful not to talk aloud to the Scarecrow, but he thought, seems like a nice enough lad, don't he, Scarebird? When he returned to the back porch, the hired hand was using a whetstone on the blade. The axe needs sharpening. Lonesome John grinned a little. It usually does. Wouldn't mind some help with the weeds, if you'd care to stay a day or so. Glad to. My name's Sam. There's a room off the barn. You can sleep there. After supper, Lonesome John sat on the porch, but he didn't play his nickel-plated harmonica. He'd feel uncomfortable with a stranger about the place. He gazed off at the Scarecrow standing lonely under the darkening sky. See you tomorrow, Scarebird, he muttered softly. Sam spent the morning with the hoe, working away steady as a clock. He's raising blisters on his hands, Lonesome John said to himself, and pulled the work gloves off the Scarecrow. Put these on. Much obliged, sir. My name's John. John Humblebuckle. Oh, Humbuckle. It took more than a day or so to catch up with the weeds. The hired hand stayed on, working under the hot sun without a hat on his head. Scarebird, said Lonesome John, you won't mind if that young feller borrows your hat. Thank you kindly, said the young man. You from someplace? Used to be. Where are your folks? We graved and prayed 'em when I was a little kid. When the weeding was done, Sam hung up the hoe and pulled off the gloves and hat. I'll head back. Lonesome John scratched his neck. I've been meaning to clear that thorn bush in the orchard, if you'd care to stay a day or so. Sure thing. Them thorns are meaner than fish hooks. You better wear shoes. It was raining at first. Lonesome John pulled the shoes off the Scarecrow, then the yellow slicker. The boy'll be ever so grateful, Scarebird. It was almost a week before they had the last of the thorn bush grubbed out and burned. He gave him the hat and the raincoat and the shoes and the gloves. After supper, the hired hand joined Lonesome John on the porch. I never saw a Scarecrow with yellow painted eyes. I had a dog once with yellow eyes. He was a mighty good friend. I'll never forget him. That's the way it is with good friends. Job's done. Time for me to clear out tomorrow. And then Sam pulled a harmonica out of his pocket and began to play a joyful tune. Lonesome John was silent for a long time listening. Then he said, it's time to start harvesting the crops. If you want to stay on a day or so, or a week or so. Yes, sir. Sure thing. Lonesome John had been fingering the harmonica in his own hip pocket like an itch that needed scratching. Now he pulled it out and smiled broadly. Do you know this tune? He began to play, working his right hand like a bird's wing to polish up the notes. When he was finished, Sam tapped his harmonica. Do you know this one? They played one after another until full dark. When it was time to turn in, John Humbuckle looked over at the Scarecrow for a long moment and turned to Sam. Do you play checkers? And then there they are. Now he has somebody to play checkers with. And that story was called The Scarebird. It was by Sid Fleischman, and the pictures were by Peter Siss. Thank you for listening.